Hello and welcome to Module 3. This module is about sentence errors. We will review fragments, run-ons, and comma splices. First, let's begin with fragments. A fragment is a word group that looks like a sentence but does not express a complete thought. Fragments begin with capital letters and end with periods. The reader, who expects a complete thought, is therefore confused when the writer's words are incomplete. Because fragments distract your reader from the message that you are communicating, you want to avoid them. Three common types of fragments are dependent clause fragments, ing fragments, and example fragments. First, let's look at dependent clause fragments. In Module 2, you learned the difference between dependent or subordinate clauses and independent clauses. You also learned that while independent clauses can function alone, dependent clauses must be joined to independent clauses in order to form a complete thought. If a dependent clause is separated from an independent clause, the result is a fragment. Let's consider these sentences. If they are to perform well in their classes, working college students must take steps to prevent exhaustion. We'll circle the dependent clause and underline the independent clause. So the dependent clause is, if they are to perform well in their classes. The independent clause is, working college students must take steps to prevent exhaustion. The dependent clause is, if they are to perform well. This clause begins with a subordinating conjunction, if, which is followed by the subject they and the verb are. The independent clause that follows, working college students must take steps to prevent exhaustion, also has a simple subject, students, and a verb, must take. Both types of clauses, dependent and independent, have subjects and verbs. The difference is that the dependent clauses begin with subordinating conjunctions and depend on an independent clause to complete their meaning. Without this independent clause, the dependent clause alone would be a fragment. However, once it's joined to an independent clause, its meaning is complete. Here are some more examples. Here's a fragment. If they are to perform well in their classes. Independent clause. Working college students must take steps to prevent exhaustion. Dependent clause followed by an independent clause. If they are to perform well in their classes, working college students must take steps to prevent exhaustion. This is an independent clause followed by a dependent clause. Working college students must take steps to prevent exhaustion if they are to perform well in their classes. Notice that it does not matter whether the dependent clause comes before or after the independent clause. In fact, some sentences begin and end with subordinate clauses, with the independent clause sandwiched in between. Here are some more examples. Fragment. When a student asks a question. Independent clause. The teacher listens and waits intently. Fragment. Until the student finishes speaking. Dependent clause followed by an independent clause followed by another independent clause. When a student asks a question, the teacher listens and waits intently until the student finishes speaking. To check your paragraph for fragments, read each group of words beginning with a capital letter and ending with a period. If a group of words sounds incomplete, ask yourselves these questions. Is there a subject? Is there a complete verb? Is there a subordinating conjunction? If the answer to the first question or second question is no, then the group of words is a fragment. If the answer to all three questions is yes, then the group of words is a dependent clause and must be joined to an independent clause to form a sentence.
In the exercise below, let's highlight the dependent clause fragments. Remember our three questions. Is there a subject? Is there a verb? Is there a subordinating conjunction? Then we will draw an arrow to the dependent clauses to which the fragment should be connected. A true friend is trustworthy. The verb is. The subject is friend. Is there a subordinating conjunction in place here? Remember that we call these boo-boo is wah-wah-wah words or subordinating conjunctions. As you can see, there is not one present. Therefore, the group of words, a true friend is trustworthy, is a simple sentence and not a fragment. And the second group of words, if I share a secret with her about a coworker, this time you have the verb share, you have the subject I, and you have a subordinating conjunction if. All right, if I share with her a secret with her about a coworker. Here we have a dependent clause. It has to be connected to an independent clause. Now, notice that following that sentence you have I, another subject, do, have. Remember that not is not part of the verb. And there is no subordinating conjunction present. So the easiest way to connect this sentence and have it make sense is if I share a secret with her about a coworker, I do not have to worry about her repeating my secret. And you've already learned the pattern, which I'm going to write up here, that if you have the dependent clause coming first, you have a comma, and then you have the independent clause, followed by the period. So I'm going to make a comma here and draw the arrow between the two. Last year I experienced a problem with my supervisor. Verb experienced, subject I, but last year is not a subordinating conjunction. Last year I experienced a problem with my supervisor. Let's look at the next one. When I mentioned this problem to one of my friends, you have mentioned here. You have the subject I, and you have a classic subordinating conjunction, boo-boo is wah-wah-wah word, when. When I mentioned this problem to one of my friends, she went straight to my supervisor's office and repeated what I had said. You can see clearly that there should be a comma here. These sentences should go together, small s, and we're drawing the connection, we're drawing the arrow to the independent clause to which that dependent clause should be connected. This portrayal of loyalty is not characteristic of true friendship. Just reading that sentence aloud. Is there a subject? Yes. Is there a verb? Yes. Is there a dependent clause? No. This is not a fragment. When I have a problem communicating with my children, is there a verb? Yes. Have. Is there a subject? Yes. I. Is there a subordinating conjunction? When. We have a fragment. This sentence is I'm going to draw that I back in since you can't see it. When I have a problem communicating with my children, there should be a comma here. I sometimes express my frustration to a friend. That is the independent clause is I sometimes express my frustration to a friend. We're going to draw an arrow from the fragment to the independent clause. A true friend will set aside what she is doing. A true friend will set aside what she is doing. That is obviously you read that aloud. You say, is there a verb? Yes. Set. And another verb over here is doing. Is there a subject? By the way, that verb is will set. And is doing is the verb over here. I'm sorry, will set is a verb. Is doing is the verb. The subject for will set aside is friend. The subject for is doing is she. What is a dependent clause subordinating conjunction? What you have here is an independent clause. This is the pattern we've already discussed, followed by a dependent clause. No comma is necessary. Because she knows it is important for me to have an outlet for my frustration. And you can't see the next screen, but I can just show you what's going to happen here. We're going to put a comma there. And We're going to join the next two together. Let me go to the next screen. Because she knows it is important for me to have an outlet for my frustration, I know a true friend will not be disloyal and talk about me behind my back. If she does, comma, I will no longer be able to trust her. Because friends are hard to find, comma, a friend who is trustworthy is a treasure. You should have this pattern down now, so I'm not going into as much detail. Because true friends are hard to find, comma, a friend who is trustworthy is a treasure, comma, because who is a boo-boo is wah-wah-wah word. You have to connect those. Because true friends are hard to find, a friend who is trustworthy is a treasure, who is worthy of my trust in return. Some fragments are not clauses, but phrases. You learned earlier in the modules that a phrase is a group of words that does not contain a subject and a verb. This fragment, for instance, includes a word that ends in ing. Having stayed up too late last night. Who stayed up too late last night? The judge delaying the trial for another week. You know who delayed the trial. It was the judge. But that ing word does not have a helping verb that it needs. To test for any type of fragments, read the suspected fragment aloud. Let's read the fragments above. Having stayed up too late last night. The judge delaying the trial for another week. These fragments sound incomplete because they are. We can correct fragments. One way is to add a subject and drop the ing word. Sue stayed up too late last night. Now we know who stayed up too late last night, and we have a complete sentence. Another way is to connect the fragment to an independent clause. Having stayed up too late last night, Sue had trouble staying awake in class. Another way to correct a fragment is to add a helping verb. The judge is delaying the trial for another week. Still another way is to change the verb to the past tense. The judge delayed the trial for another week. You're probably wondering now, how do I know which way is the best way to correct a fragment? It depends on who you're writing to and what the context is of your essays or paragraphs. Let's practice. We're going to circle or highlight the ing fragments, and then you're going to rewrite each fragment to form a complete sentence. Being the oldest child of 5. It's a classic ing fragment. So what we're going to do here is we're going to circle the fragment, being the oldest child of 5. We're going to find an independent clause to join it to. Let's see what follows. I have the greatest number of household responsibilities. You should make the connection here by putting a comma after the word 5, and you get being the oldest child of 5. I have the greatest number of household responsibilities. Whenever my parents needed help with work around the house, I was the one they asked. This sentence is correct because it has the dependent clause. Whenever my parents needed help with the work around the house, a comma and an independent clause. That is a correct sentence. Washing the clothes, vacuuming the house, doing the dishes, keeping the room clean. All these were my chores. You can see that the reader wants to put a list in to show all of the things that that child did in that home. So the clearest way to connect this without creating a fragment is to put a comma following the word clean and then a small a. Washing the clothes, vacuuming the house, doing the dishes, keeping the room clean. All these were my chores. My parents knowing they could trust me to do the work well. You can hear that this verb is incomplete. In this context, the best thing to do is to change the verb knowing to the past tense form of the verb knew. My parents knew they could trust me to do the work well. Often I was also the babysitter for my 2 brothers and 2 sisters. That is a correct sentence. My mother working 2 jobs and my dad staying late at the office. My mother worked 2 jobs. We're trying to stay consistently in the past tense. since the writer here is remembering what it was like to when he was 5 or she was 5 years old. Many nights I cooked dinner and supervised my sister's and brother's homework. Resenting the time I spent doing housework. Who resented that time? I resented the time I spent doing housework. Overall, these responsibilities prepared me for childhood. A final type of fragment is an example fragment, and an example fragment occurs when the writer cuts off an example from the point that it illustrates. These are common, such as, for example, and for instance. Some of my favorite books are classics, such as Wuthering Heights, A Tale of Two Cities, and Pride and Prejudice. One can keep in good physical shape by participating in aerobic activity. For example, jogging, swimming, or aerobic dance. If I win the lottery, I want to visit several sites in Florence, Italy. For instance, the Florence Cathedral, the Florence Baptistry, the Uffizi Museum, and most importantly, the grave of my uncle. In these sentences, the writers are including examples, but they're cutting off the list of examples from the sentence that explains, has the necessary explanation. To correct these example fragments, join the fragment to the sentence which it illustrates. Some of my favorite books are classics, such as Wuthering Heights, A Tale of Two Cities, and Pride and Prejudice. One can keep in good physical shape by participating in aerobic activity, for example, jogging, swimming, or aerobic dance. If I win the lottery, I want to visit several sites in Florence, Italy. For instance, the Florence Cathedral, the Florence Baptistry, the Uffizi Museum, and most importantly, the grave of my uncle. Please note that the use of the dash here. This is unusual, and you may say, well, I'm not used to using a dash in my writing. Well, this is the perfect place to use one, because what a dash does is it indicates to the reader that there is a phrase following. It's a lengthy phrase and a very important phrase. Because of its length, a dash is probably better here than a comma. In the exercise below, let's circle the fragments and draw an arrow. Arrow should be an arrow rather than an arrow to this. Let's draw an arrow, let me make that correction, to the sentence to which they should be connected. If I win the lottery, classic dependent clause fragment. Win, subject I, verb, subordinating conjunction. This should be if I win the lottery, comma, I want to visit several sites in Florence, Italy. We need a comma here because we have a for example fragment following it, including the Florence Cathedral. I want to stand in the middle of the cathedral and gaze at Brunelleschi's dome. There is no fragment there. I also, get to the next page here, want to walk in the passageway between the inner dome and the outer dome and admire Brunelleschi's architectural feats. Now what's following here is an example of those architectural feats, such as the use of herringbone brickwork to support the weight of the dome. You'd put a comma after feats. This should be a small s. Then I want to see Ghiberti's doors on the Florence Baptistry and admire the figures cast in gilded bronze. For example, Abraham, Isaac, Ghiberti himself, and Ghiberti's son. After bronze, we're going to put an arrow, small f, so that we can go back and circle these. I'm going to draw the arrow this way in this case, and then in this case we're going to draw the arrow back to the independent clause that preceded it. Touring the Uffizi Museum, I can gaze admiringly on the great works of Botticelli, such as Primavera, Allegory of Spring, and the Birth of Venus, which I call Venus on the Half Shell. When I read that, notice that I did not pause. That's because all of these should be linked together. The first fragment is touring the Uffizi Museum. It's a classic ing fragment. We're going to put a comma here. Touring the Uffizi Museum, I can gaze admiringly on the great works of Botticelli, comma, small s, such as Primavera, Allegory of Spring, and the Birth of Venus, which I call Venus on the half shell. Finally, I would love to place flowers on my uncle's grave. Complete sentence. He was shot down over Italy 2 weeks before the end of World War II. First complete sentence. I want to see the place where he has rested all these years. Complete sentence. When my winning numbers come in, dependent clause, fragment, we place the comma after in and we join it to the independent clause. I will be packed and ready to catch a plane to Florence. So in summary, fragments are usually occur because writers believe that they get worried that their sentence is going to be too long, so they divide them up. However, instead of making their writing clear, they create fragments. Other students swear a teacher once told them, never begin a sentence with because. Yet many effective sentences begin with because. Thank you for your attention in this module. We'll be moving now into a second type of major sentence error, the run-on.